Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Chef. So, ultimately, this movie called Chef is ultimately on Netflix. So, ultimately, you could go out of your way to say that you saw this movie. I saw it and I really did enjoy it. There's something about this movie that, like, it's simple, but I found it to just be a fun movie. When looking at it, you have it to where Carl Jasper's character, which ultimately is played by Jon Favreau, ultimately we have it to where this character is seemingly at a low point in his life, and he ultimately is going to just try and revert back out of it. Ultimately, it seems that people have started to realize that this guy isn't exactly happy, that uh, he's just kind of doing like the bare minimum work, uh, that ultimately he could say that he's proud about, but also looking at it, he's proud about his work, but also the work isn't, I don't feel what he's enjoying doing. He's just kind of going through the motions. And so while going through the motions, we have it to where we have Carl's moment or Casper's moment to justifiably try and turn his life around. Try and do something different, do something new, and ultimately try and justify that he is having a much better life. He's having a lot more fun. I honestly love this cast. Like, we really have a lot of good actors in here. Mostly, we do have John Leguizamo, which ultimately I love. We have MJ Anthony, who plays Percy in this movie, and ultimately that is to be Jasper's or Casper's son. We ultimately have Scarlett Johansson in this film as Molly. We ultimately have Dustin Hoffman, who is Riva, who is a restaurant owner of sorts, and Sofia Vergara as ultimately Inez. Interestingly enough, but Oliver Platt is all Pratt is Platt. Yeah, Oliver Platt. I'm sorry. From Ready to Rumble and also Flatliners, a movie I do enjoy. Flatliners, the original one, not the Elliot Page remake, which ultimately I've tried to see that movie like a couple of times here and there, but I've never fully fledgedly sat down and actually watched that film. So eventually I'll probably go into that. We also have Robert Downey Jr. in this movie for a brief time, and ultimately, like, I don't quite understand if Robert's character Marvin ultimately had gotten a script or not. Like, was he messing around with the script when looking at it, or was every single bit of that all reasonably just like be part of the script? Because it seemed like a lot of times like Jon Favreau was delivering this utter confusion and everything like that with with Marvin. But I think Marvin is just a really confusing character. Like, pretty much all the stuff that Robert Downey Jr.'s character clown is just so like, what? What is he even saying? Like, like, there's so many things that I thought were hilarious with Marvin in the short time that he's in this movie, and I really ultimately liked some, even like the smaller part characters from other comedians that I really thoroughly enjoy. But I won't go into all of those as well. Anyways, so yeah, Chef is ultimately about a man who turns his life around to ultimately go and seemingly uh, go into business for himself by putting together a food truck. Ultimately, I've recently, like, it seems like food trucks are even like getting into being much more of a bigger fad than there ever was. Like, I think recently I'd seen recently a interview done with a wrestler called ODB on Chris Van Vliet's YouTube channel, And ODB, that wrestler, had ultimately talked about owning her own food truck and stuff like that, along with wrestling as well. So recently, I just thought that that was kind of like, hey, that's kind of coincidence that I ultimately saw this movie and then realized, oh, that's where they go about this journey. And recently, I just saw an interview about a girl who was a wrestler and also a person that was working at a working with a food truck. So it was just kind of a coincidental thing. Life works weird like that. So let's ultimately go into a double five time. I really enjoy this movie. It's a real, like, I would call this like almost like a family journey or just like a really fun movie. Um, I thought a lot about it was really, really good. When looking at it, like, I don't really try to go out of my way to watch a lot of cooking stuff or chef things, or like eventually I'll pop in every once in a while and see a Hell's Kitchen episode or maybe a Chopped or something like that. But ultimately, like, I'm not very much a cooking person when it comes down to shows. But ultimately, when watching this, I was like, well, it's not about the food; it's about the story. And so reasonably, that's what this movie was. It was a really good story. So, ultimately written and directed by Jon Favreau. So, let's ultimately go into that double five to otherwise spoil this movie, because at the end of the day, that's all that I need to say about this film. It's either uh, you enjoyed how simple it was, or otherwise you're just like, that's it, that's all this movie was, and when looking at it, that's all it ever needs to be. So ultimately, let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this, we have to our Jean Favreau's character ultimately is to be a chef at a restaurant in the beginning. We ultimately seemingly have a moment where Carl Casper's character is to go and uh, ultimately go to his restaurant and hear that there's going to be a guy that is going to be reviewing said restaurant. It seems that ultimately Carl is going in and kind of making his usual stuff. It seems like there is nothing like really ooh wow about the normal menu that seemed to be going on with things. And so reasonably, but the thing is, it's like it could be basic food, but it could be the best basic food. You could take a lemon and make lemonade kind of thing. And so reasonably, we have it to where Carl is ultimately getting his guys together. We seemingly have Tony seemingly as the drunken character that ultimately had slept outside of his car to make sure that he's ready to be at work that day. We seemingly have Jean Leguizamo's character playing Martin, and Martin is kind of Carl's like secondhand man. Basically, like, I love John Leguizamo's character in this movie, but ultimately every single movie that John does, he always stands out. And once I saw John on this movie, I'm like, oh my god, this is gonna be a great film, because every single time I see John in some movie, I'm like, yeah, I'm really enjoying this film. Whether it's the movie The Pest or if it's the movie like Vanishing on 7th Street. I really enjoy Jean Leguizamo's character in any film. So, because he stands out every time. So, we have it where ultimately Carl is going out to get certain foods to get ready for the restaurant. And so we have it where ultimately Carl is making all these foods, sending them all out, and eventually the reviewer goes in, which ultimately is Ramsey Mitchell, who is Oliver Platt, who, again, played in the movie Flatliners. Also in the movie The Three Musketeers with Chris O'Donnell. Anyways, we go into here, and we seemingly have it to where after the food has been put out, we ultimately find out that that Carl ultimately reads his review, and it seems like at first the review of Oliver Platt's character ultimately sounds good at first, but then he starts chewing him out repetitiously in food terms. He starts like belittling his food and saying personal stuff and all kinds of things to ultimately Carl ultimately goes and notices that every single one of his friends is ultimately talking about, well, F Twitter. F all those people on Twitter. And Carl's like, what are you guys even talking about? Like, what is a Twitter? Like, what is a Twitter? What does that do? Like, we have it where Carl is ultimately just kind of like, bizarrely, we have like Twitters that ultimately are seemingly important. Mine isn't, but it is what it is. So we ultimately have Carl Casper, who ultimately goes into being seemingly on Twitter, ultimately trying to figure out what to do for Twitter by having his son Percy kind of be involved with his Twitter account consistently. Because it seems like Carl is trying to get more involved with his son, and like that's kind of like the beautiful thing about this father and son relationship. Even though he is, I would guess, separated from Sofia Vergara's character, we ultimately have it to where Carl is trying as much as possible to make Percy part of his life, even though really it's probably at first to really just go and get food, and that's probably like all that he can do really with his son for the most point. We have it to where Carl is ultimately to go and think that he's sending a message, like a private message to this reviewer, but instead it actually is actually a thing that goes on Twitter and everyone can read it. To all of a sudden there seems to be a huge explosion of of having Carl ultimately having his Twitter go out all over the place. It seems that ultimately talking we have it to where Carl had thrown some shade into Platt, and Platt ultimately goes and throws shade as well. And so we ultimately have it to where Carl is going to demand that Platt's character ultimately go into the restaurant one more time, and they'll change the menu around just for him. Well, we have it to where Dustin Hoffman's character Riva ultimately goes in the first time that Platt's character had come around, and Dustin Hoffman had talked to Casper about what he had deserved and all this other stuff. It seems like this second time around, when this reviewer is coming to this restaurant, we have Dustin Hoffman, who is now going in and telling Carl that he needs to do the menu to a T. And Carl is like, no, I wanna do something different. I wanna spice things up. I wanna make like specials. I wanna make a real special meal for this guy. So ultimately, I will ultimately win this guy over and ultimately get a good review on a restaurant. And ultimately, we have Riva, Dustin Hoffman's character, who is ultimately going in and going, no. One, you need to, every single time you go onto Twitter, you need to confirm everything that you're going to say to me. And I'm like, yeah, that's a lot of jobs where reasonably you can't go on like a Facebook or a Twitter or an anything if you have like some jobs, because a lot of times they don't want anyone to hear about any portion of your job, or they don't want to hear any like, so you can't vent anywhere. It's just you have to just say that everything is fine at your job, even though it may or may not be, which that can happen. So but this is different. We have it to where ultimately Carl is talking smack talk to a reviewer that could ultimately hurt this business. And so I can quasi understand Dustin Hoffman's character, but when also looking at it, I'm like, this guy can do whatever he wants. If ultimately he's going to one up this reviewer and make better food, then that's what he does. But we have to where Carl wants to impress this reviewer, and Riva is making it severely difficult to the point to where Carl is just like, you know what, I'm done. Like, I am done working here. Like, you could have said that Carl has been going through the motions, and when he is wanting to do something to put pride and or passion back into his job, we have it to where he is ultimately to be controlled or to be uh, shut it out, which ultimately I can understand that kind of thing. So we have to where Carl quits, and we have it to where this reviewer comes in, and we have it to where Tony is ultimately forced to now man the kitchen. So they're putting out all this food out there, and so we have it to where the reviewer ultimately, Ramsey, Ramsey, that's funny, Ramsey Mitchell, so because Gordon Ramsay. Anyways, we have Ramsay who is ultimately going, and he's like, "Hey, where is Chef Casper? Like, where is he? Like, I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to see him." And so you ultimately have it to where Dustin Hoffman and Scarlett Johansson are ultimately giving this guy wine and all other kinds of things to butter him up. And we have it to where Ramsay's eating all this food, and he's just kind of like, God, whoever, like, where is this chef that ultimately I was supposed to talk to, because his food isn't as good as it should be. Like, where is he? Like, he's clicking on the Twitters to ultimately get this out there, and we ultimately have it uh, to where Casper is ultimately seeing this thing on Twitter and calling Johansson, and ultimately like, what is he saying smack talk about me on Twitter? What's going on? So ultimately we have Casper storming into the restaurant. F anybody else. If Dustin Hoffman's getting his way, he's like, nah, whatever. So we end up having it to where freaking Casper has a meltdown right here in the restaurant with this lava melting dessert right in front of Ramsay. And so we have to where Casper ends up going and saying how much that review ultimately did hurt him, and man, is he just going off. Ultimately to the point of grabbing this guy's dessert and crushing it in his face, kind of thing. And we have it to where Casper is ultimately saying the dessert is meant to be that way, and like it's made to perfection. There's no other way to better do this dessert than the way that I've done it. And so we end up having, bizarrely, everybody and their brother evidently just videotaping this meltdown of Casper. Well, I say videotaping, but phone recording, whatever the new term of it is now, because ultimately everyone's not in a camera and going, ah. So we end up having this explosion of Casper going viral, which ultimately turns basically to the point of Casper quitting his job, but it seems like there is no other job after this that is seemingly going to go anywhere, because this video had gone viral, and when looking at it, Casper can't sue anybody, Casper can't go after anyone because it's public domain. Like any number of any other people that would tend to have at some point done a video or had a picture of themselves in an accidental way that ultimately gets screen grabbed and all kinds of things and whatever and what have you. But that's what it is. So it happens. It's going to happen to everybody, even to me. But anyways, whatever. When looking at it, it is what it is. So Carl Casper goes into reasonably going in and talking to Johansson after this whole debacle, Molly, and we have it to where she is to tell him it's like, you know what, you need to turn your life around. Like this explosion that you had in this restaurant is telling you that you're not happy. And you haven't been happy for a while, and ultimately you need to spend more time with your son that you haven't been nearly been spending enough time, because I think we have it to where Casper has been well overworked, and probably he like doesn't have time for anything but cooking, and so that could burn somebody out. That's kind of like the God, what is it? The dragonfly analogy when in the Kevin Costner movie where the one guy says it's like, hey, like I haven't lost anybody when ultimately he's a doctor, and so the other guy says it's like, well, like yeah, you haven't lost anybody, but your blade is getting a little too sharp. It's cutting everybody else down, um, while you're trying to save a person, kind of thing. And so it's a weird analogy, I know, but anyways, so but it's kind of a cooking analogy, knives, so on and so forth. So we have it to where ultimately Casper is to realize that he has no options, and so reasonably he is just going like, well, what the f am I gonna do? We end up having it to where Casper is to go with Inzel to ultimately travel to seemingly go to, I believe, Cuba, and just go in, and they're on this trip, and ultimately it seems that Casper is to talk to Inzel, and it seems that she is kind of buttering Casper up into doing this food truck that ultimately she wanted him to do anyways. And so Casper is just like, well, considering this is my only option, and plus two, this could be food that I would actually want to try and do. And it seems simple enough and it seems interesting enough. So we end up having it to where Casper goes and spends time with his son, uh, trying to, one, go to Robert Downey Jr.'s character that has some past with Inzel that ultimately, it seems like this guy has money to be able to give Casper to uh, take this take this food truck and make it something. So we end up having Marvin talk to Carl and mention that when Carl comes in there, we have it where Marvin is mentioning he kisses this like assistant, and ultimately we have it to where Marvin is going in on saying that, hey, yeah, I just found out that she's pregnant. Like she just took the test a little bit ago, and she's pregnant, and ultimately there's no way it's mine because I had gotten my tubes tied years ago or months ago or whatever, and so I don't know what I feel about it. And ultimately Carl is ultimately going like, what? Like, why do you tell me all this kind of thing? And so eventually we also have Marvin that is throwing into Carl's face that ultimately Marvin and Enzel had ultimately had seemingly a go around, a bedroom business moment at some point in time, but ultimately Carl doesn't know exactly when, because Marvin never said exactly when or in exact words what had actually happened. And so this moment is freaking hilarious, and it's so like it's so all over the place, and it's so just like it's so all over the place, and it's so weird, but it's also so hilarious, and it's like it's really the only way of which that Robert could like be the only one that delivers this kind of shtick. So we have it where Carl leaves baffled and confused, and then ultimately baffled about why he's going and doing this food truck because it looks like garbage. It looked like it came to him on fumes. That ultimately everything about this truck is just going to be a sneeze away from like basically being a unusable truck. So we have it to where Carl and his son are ultimately consistently cleaning this truck, scrubbing it down. We ultimately have it to where Carl is throwing out a lot of the appliances that are in there, like seemingly ovens, and all kinds of other things, like little seemingly like a salad bar-ish like thing that I think was in there. Uh, from what I know from like cooking appliances and such. So we eventually have it to where they find all kinds of like metal trays that ultimately at some point they're trying to scrape all the old food off to just keep all the metal plates, because ultimately if it's not rusted then they can keep all of it and reuse it somehow. And Percy ultimately throws one of the trays away because it smelled awful, and Carl desperately says don't throw that tray away, but Percy does it anyways. And eventually they keep escalating this argument until Percy throws the tray away and does not go back for it. He just walks off. Eventually Carl has to go back to him and realize that he's like, you know what, I've asked him to do like more than I honestly should. And so now it's my turn to try to, in some way or another, try to apologize to him and ultimately like tell him that I need him. I need his help, kind of thing. And so we ultimately have that really nice moment. And so we ultimately have Carl who scrapes that metal tray because he needs it. So we end up having it to where Carl is eventually going and having to go and buy a ton of appliances, some ovens, and some kitchen knives. And eventually we have this really awesome moment where Carl turns to his son and says, hey, this is a chef's knife. Ultimately, he goes into detail about the chef's knife, and ultimately he's going to hand his son. He's going to show his son that he's going to get this knife, because reasonably, like he's going to work with him. He's going to help him um, do this food truck, and so ultimately he's going to give him a specific knife that he is going to use at some point. So, like I thought that moment was amazing. So we ultimately have it to pushing on. So they order all this stuff, and so eventually they eventually get all these appliances, and we seemingly have it to where Marvin had said that ultimately there are some construction guys that some guys at this place could ultimately help Carl put in some of these appliances when eventually they do come in. And so we have it to where Carl is ultimately getting a pallet jack to try to get one of these appliances in, but ultimately the pallet jack doesn't pump high enough to ultimately help them just kind of slide in this oven to go into the truck. Ultimately, we have John Leguizamo's character that ultimately is to come by and notice that, like, okay, well, we're gonna really have a hard time to get an oven in there. I'm like, how really heavy is this oven though? I'm like, honestly, for like the most point, I guess they don't want to scratch and scrape the appliance, which ultimately I can understand that. But when looking at it, like, it doesn't need like 5 to 6 people for an oven to be put into a truck. This must be one heavy oven or refrigerator or whatever the heck that this thing is. Because ultimately, knowing full well I've moved several appliances, and yeah, that must be the heaviest oven that I've ever seen in my life. Because ultimately, they need like 10 people to go and lift this thing. And I'm like, okay, that seems like a little bit inaccurate, but okay, whatever. Like, ultimately, I guess just have like the extras kind of be a part in this movie, and that's completely fine. We ultimately have it to where John Leguizamo's character is ultimately whistling at the seemingly guys who can only speak Spanish, because ultimately John Leguizamo knows Spanish, and ultimately he says some Spanish things to them to ultimately get them to help them move this appliance. Which again, more than likely, probably a lot of these people, um, probably probably John's character or Carl's character probably has a bad back or whatever. Like it seems bizarrely in one scene, the way that like John Leguizamo was kind of moving in one scene that I saw him like in a bar, like like it was kind of weird how John's character was kind of moving his neck in that scene. Like it seems like ultimately like the way he was kind of moving his neck, like it was kind of like he was moving his whole body instead of actually like shifting his neck. I'm like, did he hurt his neck doing something? Because ultimately that's what it looked like to me. But anyways, little just intrigue about kind of the way that John was moving. But anyways, so they end up putting these appliances in, and ultimately they are to offer these guys in return some alcohol and free food. And so we have it to where they're getting their food together, and we have it to where uh, Carl is going to get their food for them, and so we have it to where ultimately we have it to where Carl and Martin are making free food for these guys, but man, are they having a lot of fun. And so it seems that Percy is ultimately making something, and he accidentally burns one of the food pieces, and we have it to where Carl ultimately notices this, like, hey, it's burnt. And ultimately, Percy's like, well, yeah, but they're getting this food for free anyway, so I don't think it should matter if it's burnt or not. And we have it to where Carl pulls Percy to his side, and ultimately he's like, hey, like, if anything, if you don't love cooking, then that's okay. But it's like, but I love cooking, and this is what I'm passionate about. So ultimately, like we need to like all together like be able to really put our best effort into all of this stuff, or kind of because ultimately it's making like me happy, and so like me happy equals you happy equals everyone happy, so kind of thing is kind of like the roundabout way that Carl goes about this. And Percy realizes that it's like, well, hey, like if food is making you happy, then like, hey, then I'll try my best, kind of thing. And ultimately Carl accepts that. So we have it to where now they are to be on the road and just kind of go about their journeys. And we ultimately have it to where seemingly Percy is doing a bunch of like videos and stuff. He's doing a lot of social media stuff to ultimately help this restaurant keep going, and Carl really appreciates that. And so they're ultimately going and traveling to New Orleans, the place that ultimately they were going to supposed to go, and so on and so forth. So because ultimately they were going, Carl and Percy were going to New Orleans, and uh, ultimately they were trying to get there, but ultimately it was just uh, Carl had quit his job, and so ultimately he's like, yeah, I don't know if we can get to New Orleans or not. But we have a tour they are going on a road trip, and so we have a tour like Carl and Percy are ultimately having these really nice moments. We have it to where Carl gives Percy a beer at some point, and he sips it and he says it's awful. It's like, yeah, like, yeah, it is, yeah. So, and eventually we have it to where reasonably like John's character ultimately puts some seemingly food powder into his pants, because ultimately we have it to where it's really hot in this plate in this area, so ultimately put a little dip in the slipping of the pants, if you know what I mean. Just kind of getting a little powder going in there. So ultimately everybody does that, and so anyways, moving on, we eventually have it to where uh, Carl is to go and get food, and then we ultimately have Jean Leguizamo's character crazily uh, like waving down Carl to say like, "Hey, dude, we have a line like out the door, so to speak." And so we end up having it to where Carl is supposed to be baffled and confused why there is such a line for this truck, and ultimately we find out that Percy had ultimately gone and done a photo of them through their social medias to help them get the word out of where they are exactly, and ultimately everybody lined up. So we have a tour they're crazily cooking, and so reasonably everything is going so well. Everyone is really happy, and really they're eventually going into further other locations, and eventually it seems that also New Orleans, like Percy just wanted to go there just for the donuts. It's like we have to where John Lang was almost characters ultimately mentioning that, like, dude, other people come in here from Mardi Gras and Voodoo, and he loves donuts. What's up with that? So we end up having it to where Percy and his father goes to donuts, and that's when the line is metaphorically out the door. So we ultimately push on to have them go into seemingly other locations where it seems like they're changing the menu for wherever they're at. It seems like John's character ultimately goes into a place that ultimately is smoking meat, and so it seems that Carl is to ultimately find specific food for that specific location to adjust his menu consistently to where not everywhere he goes it's all going to be the same stuff. It seems like at this location, which is Texas, they are to go and do sliders with smoker meat, and so ultimately it seems like every single thing is going well. We have it at some point to where Carl and Martin are testing their food, and Percy are testing their food, and ultimately it seems like they're consistently trying the smoked meat, and ultimately they are just really enjoying it. And so we end up having to push on to ultimately have seemingly this being towards the very end of the summer for Percy, and it seems that ultimately John's characters ultimately turned to Percy and mentioned how like proud he is of his son, and then ultimately he like loved the time that they had together, and that ultimately if he could have him consistently keep going and doing this whole food thing like he would, but like eventually Percy has to go back to school, and we eventually have Enzel ultimately calling Carl's character ultimately to tell him like, yeah, he needs to eventually go back to school, you know. And eventually there is some mix up on the phone where ultimately we have Enzel calling and saying that she loves somebody, and ultimately we're not sure what. I think that's just to kind of like build suspense of what is to go on in this movie. But I ultimately just kind of enjoy the where of which that this movie eventually turns. So we eventually have Carl going to seemingly do another food truck location, and it seems like he is back home now. So we end up having it to where it seems that Ramsey, the reviewer, is to ultimately go and try and find somebody else to buy food off of Carl and then test the food and taste it. It seems that ultimately Carl had not known anything about this, but we end up having them crazily trying to order food, and eventually we have it to where Ramsey is like, hey, could I speak to the chef? Like, I want to speak to the chef. And so Carl ends up pulling out of his many orders that he has to do to talk to Ramsey, and it seems that Ramsey is ultimately talking about the previous stuff about the kind of the social media battle that ultimately that they had went through at his restaurant and everything like that, and really all the harsh words that were said and ultimately hurt feelings and stuff along those ways. And so we eventually have it to where Ramsey's character is ultimately like, you know what, like that's all in the past, and like we we can move past that because ultimately I love your new food. Like I love the way that you're doing things now, and ultimately I want to set you up with a restaurant. I want to back you. I want to fund you and give you a restaurant and a location. And so we end up having it to where John comes out and ultimately he's like, "Hey, you talked to him for I don't know how long, and ultimately there was no fist that flied. That's a little bizarre." And we have it to where Carl is like, "Well, I guess one thing about that guy is he's going to be our new partner." And Martin's like, "Huh?" Like, yeah, I thought it was interesting that like Martin or Carl's character can go to this restaurant and do whatever he wants. There's no control. There's no, like, we ultimately just have it to where Carl can just do whatever, and ultimately Ramsey will try to back him 100%. So we eventually go into seemingly go into this restaurant that I believe is called All El Jeff or El Jeef or El Jefe. I don't know. I could be ill pronouncing that. Um, so we go into this restaurant, and I love the atmosphere. It looks very interesting looking. The visuals of the restaurant is kind of impressive because all that's really is towards the end of this movie is just the atmosphere of the restaurant. So it seems like this restaurant is closed for a special event, which that special event I believe is a wedding between Carl and Enzel, I would assume, because ultimately they're the only two that are really seemingly wearing wedding attire. And so we were ultimately to assume that they had gotten back together, which is a nice kind of ending. Um, like I would have kind of assessed that maybe Carl would have ended up with Molly's character, Scarlett Johansson, but I guess when looking at it, no, I think the real build up was to get Enzel and Carl back together because ultimately, so that way, uh, dad or dad and mother could get back together with their son, kind of thing. And so, and plus, there was always these kind of like little moments that I really enjoy between Enzel and Carl, anyways. So that was completely and utterly fine with me. Though, like the nice little sweet little moments between them, kind of talking things out. So that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. I kind of just talked about the movie, and like there was some interesting moments, and like I really liked. Uh, there's something amazing about a bit of like realism going on here. Like it feels like uh there's real interesting dialogue going on here. There's a real like it's a really like I think the thing that really sells this movie is just uh the look of it, the way it feels very different, and ultimately really just the overall just kind of a like the if you want to say it in restaurant terms, like the atmosphere of everything that goes on in this film, and it has a really great visual representation, which ultimately just kind of sells you throughout this entire film of just and eventually you have this really amazing moment towards the very end of the film where Carl is to see a video that ultimately Percy had made, and it's basically like their road trip through this entire movie. Eventually, seeing the cop that had ultimately tried to have them go to seemingly another location, but also take like a million photos of them together. Which I was like, so you kind of had this actor that was kind of buying for screen time. And I thought that that was actually kind of funny, knowing full well that I've seen that comedian before in another movie called Source Code. So, otherwise, I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.